Suspicion is a corrosive force, spreading quietly and steadily until it threatens to consume everything. I didn't wake up one morning suddenly suspicious of Ryan. It was more like a slow unraveling, a quiet noise in the back of my mind that grew louder over time. Ryan had always been attentive. He was the type who noticed when I'd had a hard day at work, who could read my emotions before I even had a chance to speak. But recently, something shifted. It started with small things. He'd come home later than usual, missed a call or two without explanation, and seemed more distant in our conversations. I'd ask him how his day was, and his answers grew shorter, less detailed, as though he was hiding parts of himself. Then there was the way he'd keep his phone close, almost guardedly. I hadn't noticed at first, but soon I couldn't ignore it. He'd never been one to hide his messages or turn his screen away from me. Yet here he was, subtly angling the device out of my line of sight. The first time I saw him do it, I'd brushed it off. But the next time, and the next, it gnawed at me, this growing distance between us. I tried to rationalize it. We'd been together for years. Maybe we'd grown comfortable, a little complacent even. Perhaps it was just the ebb and flow of married life. I didn't want to become one of those women, paranoid and distrustful, but doubt doesn't care about your intentions. It slips in anyway, and once it's there, it demands answers. Late one night, after another lukewarm conversation where Ryan's eyes seemed elsewhere, I lay in bed alone, staring at the ceiling, replaying the past few months in my mind. Every moment felt suspicious in hindsight, and the what-ifs spiraled until I couldn't take it anymore. The next morning, I did something I never thought I'd do. I searched for a private investigator. I didn't want to accuse Ryan, not without proof, but I needed answers. And so, with a trembling hand, I dialed the number, setting into motion the events that would change everything. Tom Sweeney looked every bit the part of a private investigator. He wore a weathered trench coat, and his gray hair was combed back with a certain old-fashioned care. When he entered the small coffee shop where we'd agreed to meet, his eyes scanned the room, and he settled into the chair across from me with a nod of recognition. I was both relieved and terrified to see him. I stumbled over my words as I explained my suspicions. Tom listened patiently, nodding, and when I finished, he asked the hard questions. How often does he stay late at work? Has he changed his routine drastically? How's your relationship otherwise? His voice was calm, almost detached, but it was clear he was making mental notes, fitting pieces together. I hadn't told anyone else about my fears. Saying it out loud made it feel real, and I had to suppress the urge to back out right then and there. Tom assured me he'd be discreet, that he'd observe without interfering, and he promised to share any information he uncovered as soon as possible. As we wrapped up, he looked me in the eyes and offered a gentle word of caution. Sometimes people get caught up in their own assumptions. Try to keep an open mind, Mrs. Daniels. Not every secret is what it seems. Those words echoed in my mind long after we parted ways, but I brushed them off. I knew Ryan, or I thought I did, yet doubt had a firm grip on me, and it wouldn't let go. Now, all I could do was wait. The days following my meeting with Tom felt like a prison of my own making. Every tick of the clock sounded like a heartbeat, every hour stretching longer than the last. I became hyper-aware of Ryan's every move, each small action carrying the weight of my suspicions. The first time Tom messaged, the notification sent a jolt through me. I nearly dropped my phone, hands shaking as I opened the message. My heart raced, expecting a revelation that would either confirm or shatter my fears. But his response was almost too simple, too uneventful. No unusual activity observed today. I reread it multiple times, trying to wring meaning from those words. Part of me felt relief, but it was quickly swallowed by frustration. Nothing unusual? How could that be possible? I'd spent so many hours imagining scenarios, spinning every possible reason Ryan would act this way, yet Tom's update offered no closure. I couldn't just stop wondering, couldn't let go of the feeling that something was lurking in the shadows. Days turned into weeks, and Tom's messages continued along the same pattern. No strange meetings, no unknown phone calls or clandestine texts. If anything, Ryan's life appeared almost too normal, almost as if he were consciously erasing any signs of wrongdoing. But doubt continued to gnaw at me. If he wasn't having an affair, what was he hiding? The way he looked at me lately, his eyes dark with something unspoken, made me feel like we were living in parallel worlds. At dinner, he would sometimes sit in silence, swirling his drink and gazing at a point just beyond my shoulder, as though he were lost somewhere I couldn't follow. One night, I tried to confront him, albeit subtly. "You've been quiet lately," I said, setting down my fork and looking across the table at him. He barely looked up. "Work's been rough," he muttered, his voice distant, evasive. "Is that all it is?" I pressed a little more directly this time. "It just feels like, I don't know, like you're somewhere else." He sighed, rubbing a hand across his face, his gaze briefly meeting mine. For a split second, I saw a flash of something, guilt maybe? But it vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving me uncertain. "I'm sorry, Claire. I'll try to be better. I just have a lot on my mind." It was a hollow promise. His words fell into the quiet space between us, leaving me feeling emptier than before. I excused myself early, retreating to the bedroom where I could let my emotions spill over in private, lying awake long into the night, feeling the weight of each unspoken word. The waiting was unbearable. I was being torn between hope and dread, each one gnawing away at me. And as the days dragged on, my need for answers grew stronger, overshadowing everything else. It was another rainy night when Ryan finally confessed, the kind of night where the world outside felt as turbulent as the emotions roiling within me. He came home late again, his face pale and drawn, looking almost haunted. I'd been pacing in the living room, my heart racing with equal parts fear and fury. When he stepped inside, he looked up, seeing me there waiting, and I could tell that something in him broke. We stared at each other in silence, the sound of rain hammering against the windows, the only thing filling the air between us. He looked exhausted, and I could feel the tension radiating from him like a force field. In that moment, I knew that whatever he was about to say would change us forever. "Ryan," I said, my voice wavering but firm, "please, I need you to tell me the truth. Are you having an affair?" The words came out harsher than I'd intended, each syllable laced with a mixture of hurt and desperation. His eyes widened, and for a brief second, there was a flicker of shock, even pain, in his gaze. "No, Claire," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm not having an affair, but there's something else. Something I should have told you a long time ago." I felt the floor tilt beneath me as he spoke. His words were a lifeline and a noose all at once, sparking hope even as they ignited new fears. What could he possibly mean? He took a deep breath, his eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and shame. "I have a daughter," he said, each word heavy, as though they'd been buried inside him for years. "Her name is Ella. She's 16 now." I stood there, stunned, unable to process what he was saying. "A daughter?" I repeated, the words foreign on my tongue. "You have a daughter?" "Yes," he replied, his voice breaking slightly. He looked down, unable to meet my eyes, his shoulders slumping under the weight of his confession. "I was married before. When my ex-wife and I divorced, things turned bitter. She refused to let me see Ella, and when I met you, I thought I could leave it all behind. But then, a few months ago, Ella found me." The room spun as I tried to comprehend this new reality. A daughter, a life he'd hidden from me, a life that had existed long before I was ever a part of his world. All the nights he'd left, all the times he'd been distant. Suddenly it made a twisted kind of sense. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, my voice trembling with the weight of my hurt. "Why didn't you trust me with this?" He swallowed hard, looking at me with an expression of utter remorse. "I was afraid, Claire. Afraid that you'd see me differently. I didn't want to drag you into the mess of my past, into all the pain I went through with Rachel. I thought if I just kept it buried, I could protect you. But Ella needed me. She reached out, and I couldn't turn her away. Each word he spoke felt like a blade cutting deeper, slicing through the life we'd built together. I turned away, trying to gather my thoughts, my emotions swirling in a storm of betrayal, sadness, and, though I didn't want to admit it, empathy. I could see the hurt in his eyes, the regret, but it didn't erase the fact that he'd kept a part of himself locked away, even from me. In that moment, I didn't know whether to be angry or to hold him, to comfort the man I loved or confront the stranger I suddenly felt he'd become. The days that followed were a painful blur. I felt like I was living in someone else's life, someone else's story. I'd always prided myself on knowing Ryan better than anyone else. Yet here he was, a man with a daughter I'd never met, a father who'd lived through a world of pain I'd been entirely unaware of. Everything felt tainted, like the colors of my life had faded into a muted gray. Ryan tried to talk to me, to explain his choices, but every conversation felt like reopening the wound. He'd tell me about Rachel, the woman who had once been his wife, and their marriage that had soured into resentment and heartbreak. He told me about the custody battles, the courtroom confrontations that had left him powerless, the nights he spent wondering what his daughter looked like, who she was becoming. It was torture, he admitted one night, his voice thick with emotion. Knowing she was out there, growing up without me. Every birthday, every milestone I missed, there's no way to make up for that. But I thought by moving on, by starting a life with you, I could leave it behind. I sat in silence, absorbing his words, feeling his pain even as my own anger simmered beneath the surface. But why didn't you trust me enough to share this? I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady. You let me think you were cheating, Ryan. Do you have any idea what that did to me? He looked away, shame written across his face. I know, Claire. I know I should have told you. But I didn't want you to feel burdened by my mistakes. I thought I was protecting you, protecting us. But I was wrong. His words echoed in my mind, each one tearing at the foundation of our marriage. I felt betrayed, but a part of me also understood his fear, his desperation to hold on to the life we'd built together. He wasn't a man who'd chosen to hurt me, but a man who'd been trying, clumsily and imperfectly, to keep his past from overshadowing his present. Yet, despite the empathy I felt, there was a chasm between us now. A chasm filled with all the words he'd left unspoken, and all the years he'd lived without me knowing his full story. One evening, as we sat in silence, I finally said, I need to meet her. He looked at me, surprised. Ella? Yes, I replied, my voice steady. If I'm going to understand this part of your life, then I need to meet her. I need to see the part of you I've never known. Ryan nodded slowly, understanding the weight of my request. And with that, we took the first step toward a new chapter, one filled with the ghosts of his past and the uncertain hope of our future. The next few days felt like a dream I couldn't shake myself from. I moved through our home like a ghost, quiet and unsteady, feeling more like an outsider than a wife. The thought of meeting Ella brought equal parts anxiety and strange excitement. She was the link between Ryan's hidden past and the new, fractured reality we now shared. But despite my curiosity, a part of me dreaded what this encounter might stir within us. Ryan spent hours telling me more about Ella, his face lighting up in a way that was almost painful to watch. He described her curiosity, her intelligence, her fiery spirit that reminded him so much of himself. For the first time, I saw glimpses of the man he had been before me. A father, a young husband, a man with dreams that had been shattered before he had the chance to fulfill them. Did she know about me? I asked one night, trying to steady the trembling in my voice. Did she know you were married again? Ryan hesitated. No, he admitted, his voice soft, almost ashamed. I never told her. When she reached out, it was complicated. I didn't want to overwhelm her with too much too soon. I let his words sink in, feeling the weight of them settle like a stone in my chest. This was the life he'd built apart from me, the life that had existed in fragments I hadn't been allowed to see. And now, meeting Ella would mean stepping into that part of his life, facing the invisible threads that connected him to a past I'd never known. That weekend, we drove to a small park on the edge of town, where Ryan had arranged for us to meet Ella. The journey there was a mix of tense silence and nervous anticipation. Ryan glanced over at me several times, his hand reaching out to rest gently on my own, a silent reassurance that I both needed and resented. I held his hand, but inside, my heart was pounding, filled with uncertainty and a fear I couldn't fully name. Chapter 7. The Meeting. As we approached the park, I spotted her right away. Ella sat alone on a bench under a sprawling oak tree, her figure small and solitary against the vastness of the open space around her. She was 16, but her posture, the way she held herself, seemed older somehow, as if she'd already seen her share of life's hardships. She looked up as we approached, her face a mixture of curiosity and caution. Seeing her felt surreal. She was beautiful, with features that echoed Ryan's own, the same deep-set eyes, the same intense gaze. But there was also a touch of something else, a fierce independence in her that spoke of resilience. "Ella," Ryan said softly, his voice trembling with emotion as he introduced us. "This is Claire, my wife." Ella's eyes shifted to me, and in that brief moment, I saw a flicker of something that I recognized all too well. Hesitation, uncertainty, perhaps even resentment. I forced a smile, feeling awkward and out of place, not quite sure how to bridge the gap between us. "Hi, Ella," I said, keeping my voice gentle. "It's nice to finally meet you." She nodded, her gaze flickering between Ryan and me, as though trying to gauge the dynamic between us. We sat down on the bench beside her, an awkward triangle of people, linked by a web of shared pain, confusion, and hope. The conversation started slowly, with polite exchanges and strained smiles. Ryan tried to fill the silences, sharing anecdotes about his life, but Ella was guarded, her responses clipped. I sensed the anger beneath her surface, the hurt she carried from years of feeling abandoned, and I knew that nothing Ryan or I could say would erase that. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Ella looked directly at Ryan, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you leave?" she asked, her words weighted with a pain that took my breath away. "Why didn't you fight harder for me?" The question hung in the air, raw and unfiltered. Ryan's face crumpled, his shoulders slumping under the burden of her words. He tried to answer, but his voice broke, and for the first time, I saw the depth of his regret, the anguish he'd kept hidden from even me. "I'm sorry, Ella," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I thought I was doing what was best. I didn't want you to grow up in the middle of a war between your mother and me. But I was wrong. I was so wrong." I watched as he reached out, taking her hand in his, and for a moment she allowed it, her fingers curling around his in a tentative gesture of acceptance. My heart ached as I watched them, feeling both an intruder and a witness to a moment that belonged to them alone. The drive home was quiet, the air thick with the weight of all that had been left unsaid. I stared out the window, replaying the encounter in my mind, feeling torn between sympathy for Ryan and a lingering sense of betrayal that I couldn't quite shake. When we arrived home, Ryan sank onto the couch, his face drawn and tired. I joined him, the silence between us stretching long and heavy. "She's incredible, you know," he said finally, breaking the silence. "She's been through so much, and yet she's stronger than I ever was. Seeing her today, I realized just how much I've missed." His words hung in the air, filling me with a mixture of sadness and frustration. "But you had a choice, Ryan," I replied softly, my voice barely above a whisper. "You chose to keep this from me, to keep her from me. All this time you've been carrying this alone, and I feel like I don't even know you." He looked at me, his eyes pleading, filled with a sorrow that pierced through my anger. I know, Claire, he whispered, his voice breaking. I made a terrible mistake. I thought I was protecting you, protecting us. But I see now how wrong I was. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'll do whatever it takes to earn it. I looked away, swallowing back the tears that threatened to spill over. A part of me wanted to forgive him, to close the chapter on this hurt and move forward, but another part of me, the part that had trusted him unconditionally, felt shattered. I wasn't sure if I could piece myself back together, let alone us. The days that followed were a test of our endurance. We navigated a new and uneasy rhythm, our lives divided between the past Ryan had kept hidden and the present we were struggling to rebuild. I met with Ella more often, gradually allowing her into my life, though each meeting felt like peeling away a layer of my own fears and insecurities. With each interaction, I saw glimpses of the family we might have been if circumstances had been different. Ella was warm, intelligent, with a wit that reminded me of Ryan's. She was guarded but curious, eager to know about the life her father had built without her. She would ask questions about our home, our life, sometimes veering into painful territory, and each time I did my best to answer, even when it hurt. One afternoon, as we walked through the park, she turned to me, her expression softened. "Thank you, Claire," she said, her voice quiet, "for giving my dad a chance. I know it's hard." Her words took me by surprise, filling me with a warmth I hadn't expected. "It's been hard," I admitted, my voice breaking. "But you deserve to know him, to know this part of him, and I want to know you too." She smiled, and in that moment I felt a flicker of hope, a fragile but real connection forming between us. Perhaps, despite everything, there was a way forward, a path that allowed space for all the love, pain, and forgiveness that our new reality demanded.